Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone gets to see. So this is a paper on the misalignment of doctrine and government goals in the development of the Canadian frigate program. There's three of us. There's myself, there's Alexander here, and there's Michael Howlett. We created a team of people who understand procurement and public policy, myself and Mike, and someone who is an expert in naval doctrine and naval strategy, Alex. So we wanted to take a look at this from a multiple layers perspective. And, you know, this is being 10 years now of trying to get ourselves some frigates to replace what are 1980s effectively ships. And after 10 years, $2 billion of money hard spent and something looking very expensive, we still have nothing. And so in our paper, we actually look at a couple of things. On the one hand, we say that we need two fundamental pieces to come together if naval procurement is to be successful. On the one hand, we need to have a clear naval doctrine that supports the development of an acquisition of either a weapons or a system platform. On the other hand, you need government policy to align with that doctrine. Canada, like every other nation, needs to make a contribution to common defense strategies. But that contribution is only as large and as effective as the human and material resources that we have. So starting from that premise, we put forward this idea. So a couple of words before, so actually the presentation, I should say, is divided in the first part where I talk a little bit about the procurement, and then Alex takes on the strategic side. Now, a few words about the Canadian Surface Combatant, the CSC project. It started in 2012 with the idea of buying 15 ships. This would cost about $1 billion each. This is on the high end of this type of costs, but it's not off the charts. So this was effectively something decent. And then rapidly, very rapidly, the costs skyrocketed. And the budgetary officer is now looking at this, scratching his head and thinking, what is going to happen? There have been delays. There have been cost overruns, and that notwithstanding, the literature, when we look at it, uniformly says that the procurement process in and of itself, which is put in place as a new model to favor the development of these ships in Canada, is actually very, very good. And the question that we had was, if this is such a great procurement process, why are we looking at no ships? So the answer to that one is that we think there is a misalignment to begin with the idea of procurement here. So on the one hand, if you look at this model, you can have either low expense or high expense procurement items. And these items can be either bought and developed over the short term or acquired over the long term. Armaments and weapon systems and weapon platforms belong to type 4, so long-term, high cost. However, we believe that in Canada, they are most often seen as type 3. So low cost, long-term, at least when politically you pitch them, right? So $12 billion was fine. It might have been fine if we just bought a bunch of FRAM frigates or something that has been developed by the Spanish Navy or the Dutch Navy, and then you just get the ships that are in a certain area. But when you build the ships, which was the political pressure here, many things change. And so instead of a type 3 procurement, we have in fact a type 4. The other thing that we should say quickly about weapon system procurement is this are very, very specific worlds. There are very few providers that have the capacity and the human knowledge to build these items. It is not the same thing to build a tanker and to build a frigate. These products tend to be technologically aligned, but highly customized. The weapon suites that go onto these platforms are very, very different. And doing what we did, and Alex may talk a little bit about that later, creating a jack of all trade frigate increases cost substantially. And then procurement cycles tend to be very expensive and very, very long in duration. And so the other thing that one should think about is that we don't have, as a country, this massively successful history when it comes down to procuring weapon systems. Our helicopters, the EH-101, the debate about F-35 or CF-18, all of these things have been rather complicated. Our cycles average about 15 years when we purchase a weapon system, whether it's successful or not. One of the things that we saw is that politics matters. It matters a lot here. And in fact, the Canadian Armed Forces, and especially the admirals in this particular instance, have been a marginalized voice. So much so that some of the people write about procurement, military procurement, have sort of pointed that as being a problem. The other problem here is that Canadian naval procurement has been on a cycle boom and bust for many decades, right? So we build a bunch of ships and then the expertise is let go. We don't continue to service those ships or to build in stages, right? So then we wait for the systems to age and deteriorate. Our sailors are now on submarines that are throwaways. In the 1990s were throwaways from the British Navy. And we lose therefore shipbuilding capabilities. Okay, so I'm gonna pass it over to Alex now for the military side of this.
Right. So what you're looking at here with this slide is the shifting government defense priorities. So of the two parts that we looked at, naval doctrine and government defense priorities, we went all the way back to 1964, and I'll just give you the quick summary of this. So the important thing here is that there are effectively only 5 priorities in the entire policy regime, of which the first 4 were all articulated by the Pearson government in 1964. And they drew on fashionable trends in nuclear strategy as articulated by people like Robert McNamara, Henry Kissinger, and in the Canadian context by analysts Robert Sutherland and George Lindsay. Now these defense priorities were: 1, collective defense, that is, Canada's contribution to NATO. 2, peacekeeping, Pearson's signature contribution to the UN. 3, surveillance, that is monitoring Canada's airspace and coasts, and later its citizens. And 4, arms control, that is reducing the threat of nuclear war and weapons proliferation. Next slide, please. Now, to these 4 priorities, Pierre Trudeau added sovereignty. He believed Canada's defense had previously been entirely defined by NATO and NORAD, plus it was the 1970s and détente was fashionable, so the importance of collective defense seemed to be falling. However, our research has indicated that whenever sovereignty was prioritized at the expense of collective defense, the Navy and the other services had the most difficulty securing procurement funding, especially during periods of economic inflation. This was exacerbated by the increasing technical complexity and political economic cost of weapon systems. So for example, during the 1980s, the Migone government promised to build a fleet of nuclear attack submarines for Arctic operations, but eventually canceled the entire program when its true monetary and political costs became evident. And next slide, please. Now, at any rate, the Cold War ended, and now there was no longer a perceived threat, and thus the importance of collective defense seemed to virtually disappear. Moreover, the Mulroney and then Chrétien governments were keen to collect the peace dividend during the 1990s, which meant contracting defense budgets and declining service numbers. Next slide, please. There was serious difficulty getting naval projects funded. For example, the Sea King replacement program is the most notable case here. However, there was another major replacement program during the 1990s, and this was the proposed replacement for Canada's destroyers, the 4 Iroquois class that had been built during the Pearson years. The Chrétien government at the end of the 90s had come up with what they called the Cadre program to build province-class destroyers to replace the DDG-280s. However, following 9/11, defense priorities again shifted, now emphasizing fighting terrorism and protecting national security, which for the Navy was quite a shift from its traditional World War and Cold War focus on anti-submarine warfare and peacekeeping operations. Furthermore, there was political controversy related to the destroyers themselves. The Navy wanted the destroyers to do ballistic missile defense. But this missile defense technology was unpopular with the Canadian public, and during the 2004 elections, in fact, Paul Martin and Jack Layton were criticizing Stephen Harper for his endorsement of missile defense. So despite this ostensibly being a priority for the Navy, Martin's own government couldn't support what the Navy wanted in this case. Now, the destroyer replacement program therefore began to drift, and in recognition of the fact that no new destroyers were going to be funded for many years, it was now merged into a general replacement, not only for the destroyers, but also for the 12 Halifax-class frigates, which had been built during the Trudeau and Mulroney years. Next slide, please. Now, to make matters worse, when the Harper government was elected in 2006, they again shifted priorities, this time focusing on Arctic sovereignty, which for the Coast Guard meant supposedly new icebreakers, but for the Navy meant delays once again to the destroyer frigate replacement, as the Harper government now prioritized the AOPVs, which are Arctic offshore patrol vessels. The Navy didn't really want or need these because they're very small kind of coastal patrol craft, but they were a government priority for Stephen Harper. The Tories were in fact planning an elaborate designed and built in Canada shipbuilding program. This was going to be called the National Shipbuilding and Procurement Strategy. It was called that. And it was supposed to be an elaborate domestic industrial benefits system was going to be integrated in this. Contracts would all be arranged before any steel could be cut. To make a long story short, the National Shipbuilding and Procurement Strategy was wildly ambitious, considering that no major warship had been built in Canada since the Canadian Patrol Frigate program concluded in 1996. Harper's agenda was, of course, then waylaid by the 2008 financial crisis and by the F-35 procurement decision, which was also enormously expensive. The Tories were soon found by the PBO and the Auditor General to be seriously underfunding these procurement programs. The next slide, please. As a result, major capability gaps emerged in the Navy. Harper decommissioned the Iroquois class without any replacement and was also failing to replace the Navy support ships. No ships were actually built during the decade the Tories were in power. When the Liberals got into power in 2015, they renamed the National Shipbuilding and Procurement Strategy the National Shipbuilding Strategy, and behind closed doors made the decision to reverse on the designed in Canada Canadian Surface Combatant and instead go with the Royal Navy's Type 26 frigate design. This was unpopular with the other potential bidders, and by now the cost of the CSC was inflating and spiraling out of control, and it was becoming increasingly unlikely that all 15 of these controversial ships would be built. Next slide, please. And I'm coming towards the conclusion here. This pretty much gets us to where we are today. The conflicting series of priorities, with the Navy losing its anti-submarine warfare-focused Cold War mission, meant that the Navy was now unable to fight its corner for prioritization, to such an extent that the most recent PBO report indicated that the CSC program will likely be scaled back to purely a replacement for just 3 destroyers, and another platform, possibly the FREM or the Royal Navy's Type 31 export frigate, may be bought to replace the Halifax Patrol-class frigates. Although none of these ships will in any event be completed until the late 2020s, or indeed the early 2030s. So the program to replace the destroyers essentially did a complete circle over a 30-year period with no ships actually built. And next slide, and this is the last slide. So what we found was that the Navy's force structure was seriously weakened by their inability to define a mission following the end of the Cold War, and that government priorities, more often than not, failed to take into account the damage that these constantly shifting political agendas were doing to the Navy. It became increasingly obvious in the Canadian Surface Combatant case that the Liberals and Tories had systematically overpromised and underdelivered. We expect this methodological approach, comparing naval priorities, that is their perception of their roles as defined by doctrine, and the government priorities, that is the cabinet's definition of their defense policy, can be applied to other states. And we're hoping to do this in the Australian and possibly the British case in the future. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Andrea and Alexander, for a very succinct presentation. We'll come back to questions later on that, so that's great. I just can't resist saying that's another Canadian success story, so thank you for that. We always need that. So now I'd like to turn to our next set of colleagues to tell us a bit about their research. This is Stephanie Yates and Alexandre Turgeon on Canadian think tanks and open channel toward the political elites. Question mark. Over to you.
Thank you. So yes, we'll talk about Canadian think tanks to see whether they are actually an open channel toward the political elites. So while elite networks can be a constraint to the diversity of ideas in the private and public sectors, the